Hello. Hello. Sorry I'm a little late. I was having drama. I've said it a few times. I'm ridiculous. And I own that. So, no worries. So I had a little bit of a debate with myself about reading this one because I'm still doing rewrites of the other ones that, if you've been consistently listening or caught up on anything, I will not be continuing with either of those stories tonight. I'm actually doing a kind of this is all going to be done at the end of this broadcast. Aren't you glad? If you were here the first week that I did a Dark Tales when it was tea. Yeah. Anyway, if you were here for that one, this is kind of a continuation. It's quite a few years later. It's just an idea. Just an idea of a way that things could have gone. Oh, by the way, check out the oh, you know what? I forgot. Hang on. Okay. I forgot the fireplace. We can't do that. We can't do that. But yeah, there was some Yule elves or something. The girl was standing over the basin in her trailer, wiping dirt from her thighs and reflecting on her life. Her mind wandered back to a memory of her parents. She rarely thought of them, but for some reason in this moment, she allowed her thoughts to trail back. The last time she had seen her mother and father, they had seemingly left her on the merry-go-round at a carnival. That was 10 years ago now. The traveling band of carnival folks that had welcomed her into their family was a strange mix, to say the least. The girl initially only clung to them out of fear of having nowhere else to go, since it seemed that her parents had left her intentionally. She might have been young when it happened, but she was not clueless, as most people assume children to be. She knew there had been whispers late at night behind closed doors. She sensed the looming doom of something approaching for years, the outcome of which she was never certain of, but silently relieved that it turned out to be abandonment and nothing worse. The carnival was both a salvation and a hell. They traveled from town to town, and every night the girl had to pretend not to notice the bile rising in her throat at the men's leers. Dark and sinister things had a habit of following the girl around. She had cloudy memories of a weird man that crept into her room late at night and made unsettling grunting noises by her bed. To this day, the faintest smell of cigars made her gag, which was often. She started out her life in the carnival as a sort of servant, since she was entirely too young for the duties she now had to endure. She knew she was even too young 4 short years ago when she was first shoved onto the small stage in the 2 big thigh-high stockings with that ridiculous ruby lipstick that made her lips look like an engorged fish. The fat lady that ran the performance stage needed a replacement for Vienna. She got knocked up and went back to live with her poor, infirm grandmother in some backwash town somewhere. And the fat lady said that the girl was already attracting attention and distracting the men. She didn't bother to tell her much beyond that there would be private performances, and she would make a pretty penny on the side, beyond having to pay her keep. The business of being fondled afterward as her first customer, a young man that was either covered in pig shit or grease or both, freaked out at her blood, pulled out too quickly and emptied his loins all over her, the wall behind her, and his own face. He threw a few bills at her feet as he ran out. Hang on. I adjusted my chair and now this is too high. This would happen a few more times before her body decided to cooperate. Eventually, she became somewhat of an expert at it and learned to escape her body during the acts. The rough cloth on her skin afterward was always a great reward. She'd become cruel and manipulative. If a customer pissed her off or went too fast or was overly handsy or rude, she'd make him drink the last customer's basin water, sometimes from 2 nights before. She learned that she had power over men in their lusty state. She even learned to enjoy some of their prodding and overly eager and mostly sloppy caresses. She started experimenting, accepting the passes of girls, discovering they were soft and less urgent in their touches. They smelled better, too. She never blamed her carnival family for the loss of her innocence. It wasn't their hands that were bathed in the blood of that first trespass. It wasn't the fault of the world in which she lived, either. The blame landed solely on the shoulders of the parents that abandoned her to this world. She didn't know, not even after all these years, why they had done it. Why would they just leave their 9-year-old daughter at the mercy of the darkest places in all of humanity? The hard truth of it was that they had abandoned her long before that fateful night. She saw it in their faces as they dressed her, read it in their bodies when she was still too small to be thought of to have perception of such things. They didn't want to be together, and they didn't want her. The swift move to a new city and a well-timed carnival provided the opportunity they'd been waiting for since she was born. No one in the town, other than their creepy elderly neighbor with the bulging white eyes, likely diseased with cataracts and that unevenly healed scar across the length of his left cheek, who reeked of cheap cigars, even knew she existed. There were no relatives since both her sets of grandparents were dead before she was ever created. There would be no search, no police, and no one was coming to find her. This was her life, and she did what she had to. She never tried to find her parents. She feared that the hatred she had for them would consume her utterly, that she would turn into a monster and do something horrible. She did often check the lines at the carnival gates early in the days just to see if she saw them, sometimes imagining that they hadn't intentionally left her behind. She would catch a glimpse that for a moment would seem familiar, but then the man or woman would turn and the similarities would wash away. She knew that she was trying to fill some hole in her that they had left there, a nice, constant reminder of what she was worth to the world. Carnival life wasn't easy. It was either too hot or too cold, too dry or too wet, and there was never a moment of peace. It took her years to acclimate to the constant moving and sleeping in the cramped cot in her trailer. They were slaves to the rich communities that they were occasionally lucky enough to entertain. She had no illusions of ever escaping this fate that she had been dumped into. It was her life, and everything in it was survival. Each passing year formed another piece of her internal mechanics. Each married man that lay down beside her took another fragment of her humanity away. She was becoming more and more a thing, less and less a girl. This life was hardening her. A particularly odd chain of events began to unravel not too long after this particular evening of recollection. She had just finished her millionth performance, crammed on that tiny excuse of a stage, with the old lamp lights inches from burning her legs, singing that same sad song, offering her services with a wink and a nudge to the fellows leering at her from the front row, when she noticed a very well-dressed man off to the side. He didn't seem taken by her the way the groveling dogs next to him did, not to say there was a lack of interest in his gaze. He seemed to be calculating something beneath the brim of his fine hat. When she arrived at her trailer about 20 minutes later, it was him and another less well-presented man that were both waiting there for her. The common man grabbed her without invitation, a sloppy, sweaty palm on her bare arm, and an assault of booze from his heated mouth against her face. The tall man in the finery slapped his cane against the rude man's thigh with an expertise that made the girl visibly shudder. This gesture nearly felled the man that had grabbed her so hastily. As he toppled to regain himself, he practically pushed her against the steel and the rust. The distinguished gentleman reached a steady hand for her, preventing her from falling as the rude man hurried away. The man tipped his hat towards the girl with a refinement that she had never been exposed to. She suddenly felt like a plastic bead in a bowl of diamonds. He wasn't awkwardly groping at her or leaning on her, legs heavy and ready to pin her down. This was so new and alien to her that she wasn't sure what to say or how to act, which made her feel young and naive. He simply reached one of those elegant hands with bone as fine as china towards the lace of her hand and took it gingerly, the way a gentleman's suitor might do to some high society lady, and placed a respectable kiss upon the backside of it, just beneath her knuckles. The world swooned temporarily. Then she had a flash of a dream, a fragment of memory. A man that might come to the carnival and whisk her away to the city in a more glamorous life than what she had known. Sure, it was only a dream, but she was certain it was this man she had seen in it. With one fluid movement, he handed her a card. It was delicate paper, embroidered and embossed with his name and position, which she barely read. He simply whispered into her ear, "Come with me and the horrors end." The girl was not sure how to take this, but something in her acted on her behalf. Before she could reason with herself, she held a hand up to gesture that she would be back in a moment, then disappeared into her trailer, leaving the door wide open behind her. It took her no time to pack a suitcase. She quickly scrawled a note for her carnival friends, which was no more than a weak apology for her swift departure and no goodbyes. Like a breeze shaking the trees for a moment during the still of night, the whisper of perfume in a long, empty room, she stood there for a moment in the dingy haze of the past so many years of her life. She took it all in and let it pass through her like a ghost. She gathered her suitcase and her small satchel and closed the door behind her as she exited this trailer for the final time. The man did not so much as try to touch her, not the entire ride to the city, which was glimmering like an alien sky over the horizon, soft and distant. He merely sat with her and seemed to watch her movements like someone studying a specimen in a lab. They did not speak. When they arrived in the bright lights of the city, the man finally made his demands of her. He had a fine house with a lavish courtyard that she was free to treat as her home, providing that she provided entertainment to his guests. This didn't sound terrible at all, and the man had assured her that he intended to make her comfortable and happy. She would just have to do him a few favors here and there. It was everything she had wanted, and everything up to now had already been a living hell, so she couldn't imagine it would be worse. At least she would be clean and comfortable, well looked after, and in one place, for once in her miserable life. That was before the guests began to arrive night after night, a carnival of depravity that had not existed in the actual carnival. Obscenely rich people were so much worse than the other classes she had encountered in this way. She was pushed into the arms of many men that proclaimed to have great power and influence, but the promises always seemed to fall short after the deed had been done. The gentleman who brought her here never pressed her himself, though. He watched over her, stuck somewhere between a father figure and someone that was perhaps desperately in love but could not obtain the object of their heart's desire. She found him oddly comforting and even developed a strange sort of crush on the man. They barely spoke, and he never, ever touched her. It was perhaps just this more than anything else that drove her crazy. They played their game of cat and mouse, and it seemed that life was settling into a nice, easy rhythm. They even began to sit together on the balcony for tea like a courting couple. Everything was seemingly in harmony, and even the parties had calmed. He was spending more and more time alone with her. She tried to keep her joy at the attention he was paying her, to herself, however. She didn't feel safe enough to show him how she truly felt. Then she arrived. She was only a few years older than the girl and chic from head to toe. She had just returned from abroad. She was all exotic, angular, and gorgeous, possessing not a single ounce of body fat or awkward lack of refinement. The girl felt something alien when she watched her walk into the foyer and drape herself around the gentleman like a scarf whipping around someone in the wind in slow motion. The gentleman in turn reached a hand around the swan-like neck of the other, the intruder, and pulled her closer to him. The girl watched and felt suddenly plain, ugly, and plump as a dumpling. She wanted to scream and run away, but she was frozen by the staircase, just watching the feline quality and grace of this perfectly sculpted being cling tighter to the gentleman. No, her gentleman. This entirely new sensation rattled through every nerve like an electric current. It was the first time in her young and hard life that she had experienced sheer jealousy. She didn't know what to do with it, so she just stood there, slack-jawed and stupid as a rock. She finally managed to rip herself from where she stood, practically sprinting past them and out the door into the brisk morning. She ran until her thighs burned and her face tingled. She found herself in the heart of the city among the hustle and bustle of people coming and going. For the first time since she had fled the house, she really looked around. The women were all finely presented and perfect. There did not seem to be a flaw among them. Her own self stood out, even in the finery that the gentleman had dressed her in upon her arrival to his mansion. She looked at the women around her and caught a glimpse of herself in the window of a nearby store. She lacked their lines, their gauntness. Where they were concave, she was convex. She had never seen herself in this light before, as she had always been so sought after at the Carnival. This was a new thing, this self-loathing that was rising in her like a serpent. The envy in her began to take hold, the serpent's kiss at the beginning of an undoing that was yet to fully dawn. She felt small as she dragged her feet back to the house, carrying so much disappointment and drowning in her own broken heart. She had lost him. She had nothing left. She initially stopped eating only breakfast, passing it up for coffee in the mornings. The gentleman was so involved with the other that he didn't notice the change. Not when she stopped taking tea in the afternoons, not when she turned away from dinner with less than half a plate of salad down. He didn't seem to notice when her clothes began to swallow her, when the bones of her cheeks began to protrude. He didn't notice because he was constantly at the whim of the other, the fine swan. He didn't halt in his steps when she came down for the gala, her eyes hollow and sunken, her skin ash, her arms fragile in the fine red dress she'd been gifted from one of the many favors she had recently turned. He didn't notice until he found her later, passed out next to a glass where the drug had been slipped into as the man that had drugged her shrugged towards the gentleman, zipping up his trousers in disgust and walking away from the entire scene as if it were an inconvenience. The gentleman stayed by her for the next 12 hours, never leaving her bedside. The elegant swan never showed her face in the room, something for which she was thankful upon realizing, but probably wouldn't have noticed anyway. The gentleman fed her soup, brushed her hair, and read her stories. The man spoke when she was finally able to sit up again. It was not what she wanted to hear in many ways, but she had known it was coming for some time. The next day, when her strength was back, she was taken to a fine hotel bordering the other side of the river from the mansion that had been her home for the past year. The gentleman hugged her on the stairs and told her that he was sorry. With the coming birth of his child with the other, he simply could no longer have her around. That's what he'd said to her that day in the big bedroom with the red curtains as his slender fingers stroked her scalp. "You are the brightest star I have ever seen, and I am not meant to keep you." Once she was settled into the hotel room, she fell into a darkness that was all-consuming. She had never felt so alone in her life, not even abandoned as she had been all those years ago on the carousel. She shut the curtains tight, pulled a bottle from the bar, and climbed into the plush bed. She fell in and out of consciousness, dreaming of impossible things and men that would love her. She never left the room. After a week, the room was no longer hers, and the hotel manager came around and unceremoniously had her removed. She was haggard and impossibly thin, carrying her garment bag over one arm and her suitcase dragging in the same frail hand. She had nowhere to go and not a friend in the world. She was lost. She walked for a ways, passing people on the street as the twilight spread over the city and began to spread the sounds of night with it. She found herself in a part of town she hadn't seen before. It was more like the carnival here. There were people dressed in costume performing on the street. There were ladies under the street lamps, their dresses hiked up to show their garters and thigh highs, the garish dress she had herself once donned back when she was cramped on that hot stage, crooning a song of carnal pleasures. She knew the game well. With no money and nowhere to go, it seemed natural. She found a building with an unsecured door and shoved her bags into a closet inside after changing into the outfit she had saved from when she first met the gentleman. It was baggy now, but she knew that no man out for a good time would actually notice or care. After hiding her bags under some garbage, she headed out to the lamps to find her meal ticket and hopefully secure enough to get a room somewhere. She hadn't eaten since the day before and thought it would be a good idea to get food out of it as well. A week later, she was working the street every night. She had secured a room in a slump house where the rodents could be heard through the thin walls every night. It made her sad about the life that she had once lived in elegance in a beautiful house and had the kind gentleman around to watch over her. Time passed like mud moving through a slide, fast and slow at the same time. Slow with the torture of never knowing where she was going to end up or if she would turn the wrong trick someday. She had some street smarts, having survived a few attacks during her carnival days when the strong arm wasn't around. She knew a little knife work and could defend herself if given enough warning. That did not shake her unease. She felt unsafe here on these streets. There was no one to watch over them here, the ladies of the street lamps. No strong arms of the carnival, no man with a quick hand and a cane. She found it easier to cope with a little drink. A little drink led to a little snort. A little snort quickly led to a habit she was working to support. The vicious cycle had gotten her. But the horrors she had to endure were inescapable. She had only met her in passing, the girl they had found in the alley with the gashes across her body. She'd bled out without any urgency from a passing stranger. She had just sat and died there in a horror that the girl did not want to imagine. She had felt a danger here before, but now she knew she had to find some other means to survive. The girl had been away from the carnival life for almost 3 years now, and she was still no one. Just another girl under the lamplights, playing the fantasy for another man she wouldn't remember. She wanted things that a girl like her shouldn't want for such a long time that those wants eventually hardened. She forgot how to feel her own pain. She withdrew and became only a survivor. The survivor was not going to be anyone's butchered ham. That's when she met the madam. The madam gestured her over to the cat house and invited her in. The madam pulled her up a chair and made her a strange tea that smelled of the earth and spices. She felt calmed and safe here in this gold room with the small circular table where they were both now sat, the buxom madam's face bright yet serene in the dim light of the room. The madam was of foreign blood, born on foreign soil. She had a bubbly charm that one wouldn't expect to find in someone that lived her life. Her flaxen hair fell in large ribbons around her face and bounced when she laughed. "Give me your hands, child." The madam sat for a moment with the girl's hands sitting in hers on the little round table. The warmth of the tea in the room seemed to pool beneath them. "You play it to men, but you are not using your powers wisely. Let me tell you how to survive. I know things. I tell you my secrets. I help you. You are a bright star, but you are going to fade out, burn out if you continue life this way. You must listen to what I tell you. Listen and obey. It will get you where you want to be. You have to become a machine. Do not let them in, my child. Be the machine that you are and become all that you are destined to be. Destroy your heart. The madam then began to give the girl knowledge of how to use her beauty to gain power over men, to enslave them. Her first target was a businessman. He lived in a fine house across the river, but in the hills, far from the slums of the lamplights. He was 13 years her senior, yet still virile enough to be attractive to most women. Now that she was thinner and had more experience in the world, she knew how to gain his attention. It didn't take much. She had moved in a week after their first encounter. Her meek weeping that first night cracked him completely. He wasn't like the men she had encountered at the carnival or the favors at the gentleman's mansion. He wasn't desperate for something young and fresh. He had that offered to him nightly. He had a hunger for life experience because he had none. Her stories pained him and drew him to her. Her sad eyes ruined him utterly. It didn't last. The constant proclamations of his love for her became draining, and she grew ever more bored and listless. This was a pattern that would continue for the next few years. She was living with a wealthy banker for a while, then a politician, then a jeweler. That was when she met JB. He was a film producer and 20 years older than her. It took him longer to crack, but he was fascinated by her life to such a degree that he even had a screenwriter come by the house to take notes. He covered her in jewels, tailored clothes, and Egyptian sheets. He gave in to her every whim and spoiled her rotten. She was still bored, though, and something felt like it was still missing. She wanted to be a star herself and not just lavished in the attention of someone promising her a break but never delivering. And even deeper than that, she still wanted something she believed was truly impossible for her. She wanted love, that all-consuming fairy tale love. She wanted to be someone's swan, someone's mate, someone's breath. She wanted the blood and the skin of a real lover, taking her beyond the carnality and into the sublime. She dreamed up a man, this creature of intensity, while she was still at the carnival. An impossible being that someone like her could never possibly possess. He haunted her now as she lay next to JB in their immense bed. The boredom and utter lack of desire becoming more and more unbearable to them both, though less so to JB, seeing as how he still adored her so much. He indulged her completely, letting her roam freely with his bank account at her disposal in hopes that the things and finery would keep her where his amour could not. While out strolling absent-mindedly through the streets one day, she looked up and saw him. He was inhumanly beautiful, with such intensity in his features that it took her a moment to remind herself that she was in the middle of an intersection. She walked closer to the cafe that he was sitting inside the window of, like a fine specimen on display, with his black hair and cheekbones, his long fingers coiled delicately around the small mug, his other hand holding a book. He was unaware of her on the other side of the glass, admiring him. Her eyes wide, the pupils dilated, her breath coming in quick gasps, making small circles of mist on the glass, watching him. He moved like a dancer, even though his feet never left the ground. His lips a rose-kissed pink, his skin a fine alabaster. He read another page of his small book, and another. Quite suddenly, he turned as if something gave him a start, and their eyes met. It was enough to shock her away from the window as if she'd been electrocuted. Embarrassed, she stumbled backward and right into the street. She toppled clumsily out of the way at the last moment before a car careened to avoid hitting her. She scurried to her feet in a fumbled movement of fabric and skin, ignoring the cuts on her legs, and ran as fast as she could back to the safety of her previous shambled home and broken life, and into the arms of the only person that she felt understood her. She spent the night crying in the arms of the madam as her soft curls rolled around her face. "Darling," her tongue clicked against the roof of her mouth as she said it. "Darling, darling girl, you know that you aren't like the girls that a man like that seeks out. Child, you have a unique and painful power. You could have him if you want him, but you will never be able to keep him." The girl woke up the next morning in anguish from the previous night's tears and alcohol. She gathered her things and kissed the madam softly on the cheek before making her way back to her fancy home with her keeper. She was hit instantly with boredom and longing. All she could picture was the image in her mind of the creature that now possessed her. She spent a few listless hours going through her jewelry, poking through her closets, and lounging around the pool, smoking fancy herbs and hookahs of gold. She was distracted all day. They sat through dinner and she mostly just moved her fork around and half-heartedly chewed every so often. He yammered on and on about some show he wanted to take her to as she absent-mindedly focused on chasing peas around her plate and thought about the beautiful stranger. Her keeper insisted they go out to the show, so she got herself ready with waning interest, but still ended up looking flawless all the same. They arrived at the theater and headed to their seats in the upper balcony among the other wealthy class who turned out in their best. She took a seat next to her gentleman and grabbed her binoculars. She began looking around the theater, something she found infinitely more fascinating than the performance that had just started. She was checking out some fashionable disaster in the lower levels when she saw a flash of black hair. Her heart stilled for a moment as her breath froze in her lungs. She didn't let the breath go until moments later, after she saw the face she had seen the day before in the cafe. They met after the show by chance. It was like being struck by lightning, and she could not do anything but be with him. She only went back to the mansion once in a month's time to pick up a small bag. She was consumed with desire as she had never been in her entire life. The workings of the machine she had become to survive were failing her. She fell more and more into the world he created and lost herself for the first time. A few blissful months passed as though only a moment had gone. Their happiness fed her where the powders and pills and money had before. She honestly believed she was now a woman, something capable of real emotions and not just the survival machine she had lived so much of her life as. They were genuinely in love, but it still mystified her, and she was so scared in the silent moments, in those gray hours when the shadows loomed. She was scared of him finding out who she was, what she had done. The chaos and insanity that her life had been, because unlike the others, he was completely in the dark. She never shed a tear or bemoaned the toughness of her life to get his sympathy. They just happened, like an explosion. She was afraid if he discovered her skeletons, he would leave, and all this happiness would go with him. He might not know the truth, but it haunted her every day. They would pass a stranger in a shop, and she might catch a whiff of cigars, which would make her physically ill, but she would stand her ground and not run, not risk losing him. They'd be at a cafe and a man would walk by and she would duck beneath the table, pretending to have dropped something to avoid being seen by someone she had known. The remainders and scraps of her former self were everywhere, and she wasn't sure how long she would have before the secrets would catch up to her. It was tiring. One evening, as they were heading in to catch a performance, JB sauntered up to her and took her aside. She excused herself from her lover, silently thanking JB for his discretion. That's when he delivered the news that would send cold chills down her spine. She told her lover that she was not feeling well, but not to worry too much, and to enjoy the show. As he reluctantly went back inside, she ran to the only place she had to go. break his heart to save him, was all that the madam said just after midnight as they sat in the small gold room, sipping the lovely tea that reminded the girl of the earth. The girl could not believe she was here, having to make this sacrifice. She knew that what JB had told her was the truth, and she knew the madam was right. It was the worst moment of her life. Early in the morning, she walked back to their home with her heart in her throat. With every step, she felt herself breaking apart. This was like death. She knew she would never love anyone ever again. For months, she went back to old habits, anything to escape his tears and his pleas. She had lied with every word that had passed her lips, ripped out a piece of herself with every lie. He handed her his heart and she tossed it to the ground, spit on it, and ground it to nothing. Little did he know that she died as she did so, and that every moment of everyday sense was a living hell unlike any that she had endured. The news of his death came to her during the highlight of her success and quite by accident. She could not cry or even pause at the news. She would never be exactly the same, and those closest to her would never really understand. New success had brought her new friends, after all. New friends that only knew her as the star and could never really know her, at least not now. Years later, after the story of the girl's life had been broadcast to every corner of the continent, she was left to herself. She had made her mark on the world, had been a bright star indeed, but she had sacrificed her heart and happiness to do so. Even as the party guests hugged her and praised her for all her successes, she felt totally alone. There was no one there to share it with. And her heart had died all those years ago. She sat in silence in the room after all the guests had left. It was dark and quiet. The only sound was her own breath in the stillness. That's when she heard it. The faint whisper in her ear. I would have loved you in spite of your secrets. Why didn't you just tell me? And that is the end. So that was my story, and I, spoiler alert. So that entire thing actually coincides with my band Among the Weeds album Temple of the Machine, and there are some Easter eggs hidden in that album, and if you look at the clock, it will tell you the actual song order that you're supposed to listen to the songs in, and it coincides with the story. So, pretty cool, I guess, if that's your thing. So, you guys, everyone here is kind of getting the progress in a way, because I'm sure that before these go to get published or whatever, that I'll probably edit them again. That's just the nature of the way it is, and I'm like that with everything I do. It's very hard for me to call something done and to just be like, okay, no, that's enough. No, stop, just leave it. It's fine. Don't re-record the song. Don't re-record the vocals 500 more times. It's fine. Just leave it. The songs happened first, and then I wrote the story based on the emotion behind the songs. And so, like, the first Dark Tales that I read, which was the day the Carnival came to town, which was the first part of this story, ended up coming from the song Abandoned on Temple of the Machine. And if you listen to it, I mean, you can definitely hear how it influenced the story or whatever. And this is kind of the same. Anyway, I am going to wrap up because I still have to clean all this up and I'm going to turn into a pumpkin. So it has been so awesome chatting with you all, and I want to thank everyone who sat with me and listened to my story, and let's do this again next week. And in the meantime, thank you so much, everyone. Please take care of yourselves. Give yourselves a big hug. Whoa. Give yourselves a big hug, and self-care is important, and let's all keep fighting the fight. Take care, everybody.
Good night.